My story begins when Jake and I sat under the shade of a massive elm tree on the eastern hill of the cemetery. We were eating our lunch, watching the funeral procession from a distance. The mourners were already sweating in their black suits, dabbing their foreheads in the oppressive late-morning sun. Jake and I knew the cues, and we started packing up. I set my lunchbox down by the stump I was sitting on and snapped my suspenders onto my shoulders with a heavy sigh. Well, looks like it's gonna be a hot one. Jake grunted in agreement, chewing the last bite of his sandwich. By the time we were packed, the service was wrapping up. The mourners in their dark clothes hugged each other briefly before starting to disperse. Our beat-up blue groundskeeper pickup truck rumbled down the grassy hill. It pulled to a stop with a loud squeak right at the open grave. Jake and I rolled up our sleeves and put on our wide-brimmed hats. We grabbed our shovels from the truck bed. The coffin was still sitting on the chrome frame and straps of the lowering device. It was strange for it to not be lowered at the end of the service. Jake walked past the coffin, tapping the brass nameplate at its foot. I leaned in closer to read it. Xander, the Great Centauri, I read aloud. I stuck my shovel blade in the grass and rubbed the back of my neck. Who's that? One of the best to ever do it, Jake said, his voice low. Do what? I asked. Magic, Jake said, grabbing the crank of the lowering device. He began turning it slowly, and the straps groaned as the coffin started its descent into the grave. Magic. Jake stared off into the distance, a strange, reverent hush in his voice. The Great Centauri. You mean like a rabbit in a hat and stuff? I asked. Jake scoffed, the crank squeaking rhythmically. Rabbit in a hat? Why, he could pull an elephant out of a hat if he wanted to. An elephant, I said, my eyes wide. The coffin settled into the deep shadows of the grave. He could disappear right in front of you, Jake continued, the straps going slack as the coffin touched the earth. Heck, he could make someone else disappear and then reappear in Miami. Miami? I repeated, bewildered. I saw him pull the old switcheroo with my own eyes, Jake said. He began unsnapping the green straps from the frame. The old switcheroo? I asked, watching the straps snake away. That's when he trades places with you, Jake said, standing up straight. He traded places with you? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Well, not with me, Jake admitted with a shrug. But I saw him trade places with another fella, and sheesh, he shrugged again as if words failed him. Could you imagine? Imagine, I echoed, my mind racing. We lined up on either side of the grave to lift the lowering rig. Swapping places with someone else, Jake grunted. I grunted along with him as we lifted the surprisingly light frame. Swapping places? I'm me, you're you, Jake explained as we walked toward the truck. And all of a sudden, I'm over there and you're over here, looking at me. We loaded the frame onto the truck bed with a clang. I'm me? I asked, still trying to grasp it. We grabbed our gloves. But you're over here, Jake said, pointing to where he stood. Looking at me, we gathered our shovels again. Looking at you? I pushed my hat back, scratching my forehead. Sounds kinda confusing, I guess. Exactly, Jake said, a grim finality in his tone. We marched back to the grave and, in a motion born of pure routine, sunk our spades into the massive pile of unearthed dirt. The first shovelfuls of dirt rained down, a coarse shower that rattled like hail on the polished mahogany below. The sound slowly thickened to padded thumps, and then there was only the soft, churning whisper of the earth. We tamped the earth flat, our shovel blades ringing thinly in the quiet. An orange and purple sunset cast long shadows across the rolling hills of the cemetery. We loaded the shovels into the truck and crowded into the cab, Jake behind the wheel. The old truck puttered through the winding grounds. The funeral home was as ancient as the grounds, a colonial-era building with thick, vine-covered pillars and weathered white wood. Jake backed the truck up to the loading door of the casket vault. I hopped out and put all my weight into the gargantuan metal door, pushing it open. It squealed in protest before thudding to a stop. Jake backed the truck into the cavernous garage. The motor sputtered, and the truck lurched to a stop. Jake's usual way of killing the engine. We didn't need to unload the lowering rig, since we'd be using it again first thing for Mrs. Gable. Jake tucked his gloves into his back pocket. Guess we should get Mrs. Gable ready for tomorrow. Yep, I said, my voice echoing slightly in the big space. We strolled shoulder to shoulder across the concrete floor and pushed through the heavy, dingy plastic strips that separated the prep room. The prep room was sterile and cold, with a single coffin at the far end. I started dragging the bier, our name for the coffin cart, behind me. I set the bier at the foot of the coffin and locked its wheels with a kick of my boot. Jake and I stood on either side of the coffin, gripped the bars, and nodded. With a smooth, practiced lift, we pulled the coffin onto the bier. I held a steadying hand on the coffin as Jake pulled the bier into place and locked the wheels. "Good night, Mrs. Gable," Jake said, patting the coffin. "See you in the morning." As he turned, I squinted, noticing a patch of greasy smudges around the foot of the casket. I pulled a rag from my pocket, spit on it for good measure, and began buffing the brass handle. I finished up with the nameplate, polishing it to a high shine, and then I froze. My hand stopped moving. My breath caught in my throat. "Night, Kip," Jake said, his footsteps echoing as he turned to leave. "Jake," I said. My voice was tight. Jake stopped and half-turned. I didn't answer. I couldn't. He turned all the way around and saw my face. He froze, too. "Kip," he asked, taking a careful step toward me. I started backing away, pointing a limp, trembling finger at the nameplate. "How?" Jake walked around the coffin, put a hand on my shoulder, and gently pushed me aside. He pulled off his hat and leaned in to read the nameplate himself. He stared at it for a long, silent moment before standing up straight, putting his hands on his hips. "Well, ain't that something?" "The Great Centauri," I whispered, afraid the corpse might hear me. "You think he's in there?" Jake put his hat back on and crept to the side of the casket. He pinched the clasp. He slipped his fingers under the edge of the heavy lid and turned to look at me. Abracadabra. He pushed the lid open with a soft whoosh and stepped back. I craned my neck from a distance. "Is it him?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Come take a look at this," Jake said, waving me over. "Just tell me," I commanded without any real conviction, my feet already carrying me forward. I stood next to Jake and looked down. It was the Great Centauri, with his thin mustache, pointy goatee, and jet black hair pulled back tight. And maybe it was just the light, but I could have sworn there was the tiniest smirk on his face that hadn't been there before. I whispered in pure awe, "The old Switcheroo." "The old Switcheroo," Jake confirmed with a slow, reverent nod, taking in the posthumous final trick. A cold thought hit me, and I turned to Jake. "Then, who did we just bury?" Jake let out a surprised, relieved chuckle. "Sure hope it was Mrs. Gable." I chuckled too, a nervous, high-pitched sound. But then, from the far side of the garage, we heard it. A single, metallic scrape, like a shovel being picked up from the concrete floor,